Chapter 5. The strongest form of the arguments. Before discussing the strongest forms of the arguments, it is perhaps important to revisit the two main arguments that have been elaborated in this book, namely, the arguments made by Al-Ghazali and Ibn Sina. Al-Ghazali writes, quote, "We say that the occurrence of every occurrence has a cause. The world is an occurrence. It necessarily follows that it has a cause. We mean by the world all existence other than God. And we mean by all existence other than God the bodies and their forms. We have included two principles. Our opponent might deny them. We say to him, which of the principles do you dispute? He might say, I dispute your statement that every occurrence has a cause. How did you know this? We say this principle must be affirmed because it is a priori and necessary according to reason. We mean by that which is occurrent that which was non-existent and then became existent. Thus we say, was its existence before its existence impossible or contingent? If it is false, it would be impossible. Since what is impossible can never exist, if it is contingent, then we mean by contingent only that which is possible to exist and is possible not to exist. However, it is not a necessary existence because its existence is not necessitated by its essence. We do not intend by a cause anything other than a giver of preponderance. In summation, for a non-existence whose non-existence continues, its non-existence would not change into existence unless something comes along that gives preponderance to the side of existence over the continuation of a non-existence. If the meaning of the terms is fixed in the mind, then the intellect would have to accept this principle." End quote. As mentioned in the previous chapter, the main objections to this argument relate to the second premise, namely, that the world had a beginning. We discussed how a post-eternal infinite set of things is not inconceivable, even on a Ghazalian conception, so long as such infinity is linked with the will of God. Al-Ghazali attempts to prove the will of an external assorting agent through the argument from particularization. A second objection relates to the idea of causation, which was also mentioned in the previous chapter. David Hume made reference to the problem of induction, while Bertrand Russell highlighted the fallacy of composition. Both Hume and Russell aimed to show that causation of the universe ought not to be a philosophical given. The issue with this is that it may assume that the universe is all that exists. In defining the alam, Al-Ghazali described it as everything that exists other than God. Moreover, some take causation of the universe to imply temporality and cannot imagine cause and effect as happening without a preceding cause and a succeeding effect. In this way, as we have seen in the previous chapter, it is impossible to argue for a time before time, as the latter proposition would be required for the affirmation of the former. As one may predict, discussions on metaphysical causations and mereology are not lacking in the philosophical literature. Linking back to chapter 1 of this book, I will argue that these discussions are unnecessary in reaching a conclusion about the necessary independent existence. As a reminder, Ibn Sina's argument is summarized in the following quote. Quote, "Now, the proof for the existence of God runs as follows. There is no doubt that there is existence. Every existent, by virtue of itself, is either possible or necessary. If necessary, then this is the existent being sought, namely God. If possible, then it will ultimately require the necessary existent in order to exist. In either case, God must exist." End quote. As alluded to in chapter 1, a possible existence is an existence that could not be any other way or in non-existence. The opposite of this is a necessary existence, in that the existence cannot be any other way, like 2 plus 2 equals to 4, and is completely independent. Ibn Sina and many of the Ash'arites, who were influenced by him, argued that the independent necessary being could not be a series of infinite possible things, since such a series can be conceived of in any other way and would be dependent on its parts. It could not be more than one, since one of the two of necessary beings would have to be conceived of differently compared to the other being. It is illogical to presume the existence of two independent beings. Arguing on these two tracks, as proposed by Maimonides and Ibn Tufayl in the previous chapter, could take the following conditional form. There is no doubt that there is existence. The world is in existence. If the world had a beginning, it is likely to have had a cause. If it had a cause, we can infer strength, knowledge, will, ability from that cause. That is because the effect of that cause exhibits the consequences of an agent with those attributes. If the world is eternal, or part of an infinite order of multiverses, it must be either a possible dependent existent or a necessary independent one. It cannot be a necessary independent one since it can be conceived of in another way. It must therefore be possible dependent. If this is so, it must be dependent on either dependent entities or independent ones. If it is dependent upon other dependent entities ad infinitum, then such an aggregation of entities will form a series of dependent possible things. Such series can be conceived of differently and are dependent on their constituent parts. What is required is an independent, necessary being with no parts and which cannot be conceived of in any other way. There cannot be more than one such a being, since it would entail that at least one of these beings is differentiated, possible, or dependent. As seen in Chapter 1, the second track of the argument can be made either ontologically, in the mind, or cosmologically, in the physical world. In this way, it is applicable in all conceivable realms and satisfying to materialists, dualists, and idealists. Although this argument was initially made by Ibn Sina with reference to causation, it does not require causation. In this way, the arguments about causation become tertiary matters of philosophical consideration. For these reasons, the argument made in this way is what I consider the strongest form of the argument. It would seem that the only way to refute such an argument is either to deny the categories of necessity's possibility, or to reason that only possible existences can exist and that existence is not contingent on a necessary existence.